Okay. Let's see where we're up to here in our discussion about Daas, Acheres, Makneh. We said that according to RavAsi, Daas, Acheres, Makneh is Doraisa, and therefore, in the case of lulav, if the gadol is makneh the lulav to the katan, then the katan is zoche midoraisa based on das acheres makneh. So even though the katan is a bar das and he's not capable of das koneh, but we don't need das koneh as long as we have das makneh. Now the question is, how does this operate? Because if a gadol is being zoche through das acheres makneh on behalf of a katan, then you must be operating midin shlichus. And we established that a katan is not included in shlichus. And we said that there are two halachas. Number one, a katan can't appoint a shliach, minui shliach. And number two, a katan is not capable of having a shliach, even if we would circumvent the need for minui. Nevertheless, the katan is mufka from shlichus, and that's why a katan can't have a chatzah, because chatzah is mitam shliach, and a katan doesn't have shlichus. So the chatzah cannot operate on behalf of the katan to be konen zoche b'shvil katan, because that would only operate based on shlichus, and a katan cannot have shlichus. So how does this work according to RavAsi, that we have something called Das Acheres Makneh, which apparently works midin schia, which is predicated on shlichus? Now, is it possible to suggest the following? It's true that schia is mitam shlichus, but schia is mitam shlichus in a situation where we need das koneh in order to effectuate a kinyan. As far as the Maisa kinyan is concerned, Zechia could substitute and qualify as the Maisa kinyan even without shlichus. And therefore, what we're going to say is the following, that if this das acheres makno so, then you don't need das koneh. You just need a Maisa kinyan. And as far as the Maisa kinyan is concerned, Zechia is operative even without shlichus. So a katan can be zocher in a case where there's das acheres makneh, and why is that so? Because what we're saying is that when is schia mitam shlichus, that's when you need das koneh. But in a case of das acheres makneh, that substitutes for das koneh. Ella, what you're going to say? I need shlichus on the Maisa kinyan. Here's where Zechia steps up to the plate, so to speak, and obviates the need for shlichus. Zechia is superior and supersedes shlichus, at least as far as the Maisa kinyan is concerned. So when Tosas says that Zechia is mitam shlichus, he's talking about a case where you need das koneh. If you need das koneh, then you're going to have a shliach who supplies the das koneh on behalf of the koneh. And that's not going to work for a katan. But as soon as we circumvent the need for das koneh, and that we can achieve through das acheres makneh, then we don't need the zoche to serve as a shliach to set up the das koneh. We only need the zoche to set up a shlichus for the Maisa kinyan. And here we're going to say that schia operates even without shlichus, because schia, the etzem Maisa kinyan, as it relates to the zoche, doesn't require shlichus. It's a separate parsha called zechia. Okay. Now, at this point, by the way, John, how long can you stay today? I just want to get a time frame. Till you can stay till 11? Okay. So after this, I have to go to the OU Center. You know, they have this program for ladies. Now, if you recall, we had mentioned Reb Chaim in Hilchos Yibum v'Chalitza Perek Dalet. And there, Reb Chaim spoke about what's called Daas, as opposed to Kavanah. Daas is related, according to Reb Chaim, to Bailus. In other words, if I'm the Bailim over the Chalos, and I create the halachic change, then I have to do so with Daas. Like take, for example, Kiddushin. The Baal is Makadish and Isha. He supplies the Bailus to set up the Chalos Ishus, and that could be done with Das Bailim, or let's say Gerushin. The Baal is going to create a Chalos Gerushin to be Mato L'Shuk, and for that, we need a Das Bailim. However, Reb Chaim says that Chalitza does not require Das Bailim because you're not the Balim over the Chalos. You're not creating the Heter Isha L'Shuk. That happens Memela, and all we need is Kavana for Chalitza. Now, let's see how the Chiddush here of Reb Chaim connects to Shlichus. Right, so far Reb Chaim is talking about Das as opposed to Kavana. Das in the case where you have Bailus over the Chalos, and Kavana in the case where the Chalos is Chal Me'elav. What about Shlichus? We have a principle which is established by the Sugya in Ksubas Daf Ayin Dalid, that Kol she'eno b'shlichus, eno b'tnai. Now, Tnai is derived from Bnei Gad u'Bnei Ruvain. And the issue at stake in Bnei Gad u'Bnei Ruvain is a kinyan in Eretz Yisrael. And with regard to kinyanim, we have something called a Tnai. I could set up a kinyan ala Tnai. And therefore, the parsha of Bnei Gad u'Bnei Ruvain teaches us that there's a power to create a Tanah. However, the case of Bnei Gad u'Bnei Ruvain, insofar as it's a case of Kinyan Mammon, that lends itself to Shlichus. And therefore, what we're going to derive from Bnei Gad u'Bnei Ruvain, that although you have the power to create a Tanai, like Moshe Rabbeinu said to them, if you go Chalutzim, then you'll gain the Gilad area, over Yarden, whatever it is. If you don't go Chalutzim, you won't get it. So all that Chiddush of the Parsha of Tanai only applies in that particular case of the Torah of the Parsha of Bnei Gad u'Bnei Ruvain. That's a Parsha of Shlichus. Like, for example, it wasn't that every single member of Shevet of Shevet Gad, right, would come forward and make a kinyan. Maybe the Nasi would make a kinyan and be zoch on behalf of every member of his Shevet. So there's representation here and agency with regard to the kinyan of Eretz Yisrael, and that's called shlichus. So when do we derive the parsha of Tanai and the power of Tanai? That's only when there is shlichus. We are very much connected, so to speak, and bound. I would almost call it restricted to the case in which there was Tanai. And what could we identify as that case? It's a case where there's shlichus. And each one of Klal Yisrael, each member of the Shevet who was zocha in Eretz Yisrael, he was zocha through a shliach. And in that case, there's a Tanai, and only under certain conditions will you be zocha. Says Reb Chaim, what's the connection between shlichus and Tanai? I mean, it's true that the case of kinyanim And Yerushas Eretz Yisrael, as Chiyah Eretz Yisrael, is a case of both Shlichus and Tanai. But the Gemara's formulation of a principle called She'eno b'Shlichus Eino b'Tanai is a little bit odd. Why do we need, in order to measure and determine whether there's Tanai, we have to see whether it lends itself to Shlichus? Well, what kind of a measurement is that? It seems like you're combining apples and oranges here. Says Reb Chaim, what is Tanai? What is the source or the origin of the ability of someone to create a Tanai? It's what we call Bailus ala Maisa. He's the Bailim to create the Chalos. And he therefore can determine, well, I want to put a condition in that Chalos. If I'm the boss, if I'm the generator of this Chalos, then I generate the Chalos only under specific limited conditions. Says Reb Chaim, if he can't make a shliach, that's a proof that he's not really the Bailam on the Maisa. If he was the Bailam on the Maisa, then he would certainly be able to appoint a shliach and ask the shliach to represent him as the Bailam on the Maisa. He can take his Bailus and he can transfer it over to the shliach, such that now the shliach is Omeid Bimkom HaBailam. If he can't do so, and there is no shlichus, then that proves that he's not the Bailam. So, for example, if you would talk about Gittin and Kedusha, there's shlichus, and therefore there's Tanai. But if you talk about Chalitza, then there's no shlichus in Chalitza, right? The Choletz, the Yavam, cannot send a shliach, and neither can the Choletzes, the Yavama, send a shliach to represent them. It's something they have to do personally, begufam, because they really have no bailus over the Maisa Chalitza. They just do the Maisa, and whatever happens, happens. The Chalotz is Miela. And Reb Chaim wanted to prove this point based on Tosfos there in Ksubas Daf Ayin Dalid. The Tosfos Dibra Masil Tnai, the Efshel Kiyume. The Gemara says that a Tnai is only Chal and Gittin and Kedusha, but not in Chalitza. Why? Because Chalitza does not lend itself to Shlichus, and anything that doesn't lend itself to Shlichus does not lend itself to Tanai. Kol Milsa the Lecha b'Shlichus, Lesa b'Tanai. Chalitza Lesa b'Shlichus, and therefore Lesa b'Tanai. So Tosfos says the following: V'im Tomar Masvar Yeshkan. What's the logic here that since you can't send a shliach, like in the case of Chalitza, you can't make it Tanai? V'yesh Lomar. To Hainu Taima, to Holva Maisa Kol Kach Biyodo, Sheyachal Lekaimal Yidei Shliach, Svarahu Sheyek Mochen Biyodo LaShvuye Beit Tanai. Avol Chalitza Shein Biyodo Lekaima Al Yidei Shliach Lo Havi Biyodo Nami Lemir Beit Tanai. So we emphasize in this Tosfos the words of Biyodo. Tosfos asks whether or not the Maisa is biyado. If the Maisa is biyado, and how do I measure that it's biyado? He could be Makayim through a shliach, so the Maisa could be done through an agent. Then, if indeed he has biyado, then we should grant him the biyado to create a Tanai and say, I only want this Maisa on such and such a Tanai. In the case of Chalitza, where's the biyado? Can he be Makayim the Maisa through a shliach? No, ain't biyado l'kaima yidei shliach, and therefore it's not biyado for shliach. It's not biyado to create a Tanai. So Reb Chaim explains that what Tosfos wants to say is that what you need for both shlichus and Tanai is a chalos bailim. You need a bailim, and if you don't have a chalos bailim, that's ma'akeves. That removes shlichus and Tanai. So both shlichus and Tanai emanate from the same source, namely, bailus over the Maisa. If I bailus over the Maisa, then A, I can appoint a shliach, and B, I can create a Tanai in my Maisa. So dafka bailim ala Maisa yicholim la lemano shliach o lahasnos bo Tanai. Choletz is ein lo bailus ala Maisa chalitza sherei chalitza ksherim in Torah af b'li Daas. Okay, that's the sugya in Yevamos daf kuf vav. So therefore, if there's no requirement of das in chalitza, then he's not considered the Baal HaMaisa. Whenever you're the Baal HaMaisa, you require das. Whenever there's das as a requirement, it means you're the Baal HaMaisa. In the case of chalitza, we don't require das, and therefore, you're not the Baal HaMaisa. If you're not the Baal HaMaisa, then number one, you can't send a shliach, and number two, you can't make it tonight. And the P'tur Ha'isha, the fact that she now is Muteres Lashuk al Yidei Chalitza, that's Chal Memela Min HaShamayim. Me'elav, as we say. V'ein Sorach L'das Bailim Lifol Es Chalos HaHeter L'Shuk. All we need from the Chalitz is Kavana to a Maisa Chalitza. Okay, now let's see if we can take all this back to our discussion. Tosas holds that Tzchia is mitam shlichus. But when is that so? That's going to be so when the requirement is das bailim in order to create a chalos. We need shlichus, we'll call it a chalos din shlichus, whenever there's halacha and a requirement of das bailim in the creation of the chalos. Then we need shlichus. So it means that you need das bailim to create the chalos, and the bailim could now appoint someone as his representative, as his shliach, to create that chalos. But what happens if we don't need das bailim? If we can create the chalos even without das bailim, in such a case, we have a din of zechia as a separate din that's independent of shlichus. It's zechia without shlichus. And here's where the principle of das Acheres Makneh kicks in. If the kinyan is chal as a result of das Acheres Makneh, then we're not requiring das bailim. Let's start the other way around. I think it'll be clearer. Let's say the kinyan is chal mikoch das kona. You need the das kona to be zocher. Then a zocher is the bailim on the chalos kinyan. And that's called the milsa de isa b'shlichus and isa b'tnan. So then, if we require das kona, then the only way that the zechia could be chal is through shlichus. In other words, if I'm being zoch on your behalf, and you require das kona, then I have to be your shliach in order to be zoch on your behalf because you are the bailim over that chalos. How do I measure the fact or prove the fact that you're the bailim on the chalos? Because we need your das to be kona. If we need your das to be kona, you're the bailim on the chalos kinyan. Hence, you can create a shliach, or zechia could work mitam shliach because you're the bailim. So if somebody makes a kinyan on my behalf, and there's a requirement that I have das kona, then that person could only make the kinyan on my behalf through shlichus. But now we get to a case of das acheres makneh, where the das for the kinyan is supplied by the makneh. He's not just my shliach, he's the makneh. The zocher, in such a case, doesn't have the capacity to create a shliach on this kinyan. He's not the bailim on the kinyan. We don't need his das. We have das acheres makneh. So the Das Kinyan is totally exclusively supplied by the Das Makneh, and we don't need the Das Kona. In such a situation, we don't need a Chalos Shlichus. There's a separate din of Zechia. And in fact, we can't have Shlichus here because he's not the Bailim over the Chalos, because we don't need Das Kona, all we need is Das Makneh. So that the Kona is sort of, in a sense, just there to receive the Kinyan, but he's not an active participant in the Das for the Kinyan, to create the Kinyan. If he's not the Bailim, then he doesn't have the capacity to create a Shliach. Because Reb Chaim explains that in both Shlichus and in T'nai, we need to have the precondition of Bailus and Das Bailim. But here, we don't have Das Bailim. And why is that? Because Das Acheres Makneh effectuates the Kinyan as a one-man show, as the Das Makneh. We don't need the Das Kona. So from the Kona's perspective, there is no possibility of Shlichus. So what's the new Parsha that allows me to be Zocha on the part of so-and-so when we're operating with Das Acheres Makneh, and that so-and-so cannot appoint me as a Shliach because he's not the Bailim, we don't need his Das. There must be a new Parsha of Zechia. So basically what we're saying is that in a case of Das Acheres Makneh, Shlichus would not operate. It can't be that the Makneh, who is operating on behalf of the Zocher, Midin Zechia, is his Shliach. He can't be a Shliach because that person who's Zocher is not the Bailim over the Kinyan. Haraya, he's not producing Das Kona. So the only way that we could understand Zachar Li'adam Shelo B'fanav is through a new Parsha of Zechia that's not predicated and not operating with the mechanics of Shlichus, because you cannot have the Zocher appoint you as a Shliach since he's not the Bar Das. He's not supplying the Das here. It's Das Acheres Makneh. And if he's not the Balabas over this Kinyan, and he doesn't have Das Bailim over the Kinyan, then there can't be Shlichus, because Reb Chaim says Shlichus can only operate when there's Das Bailim. Meaning, mi samcha, who gives you the power and the authority to set up a shliach? The answer is because I'm the bailim over the chalos. I can do it in any way I choose. Says Reb Chaim, if it's a milsa de isa b'shlichus, it means that's a gili milsa, that it's a bailus and a das. But let's say we have a kinyan that's chal without das. In such a case, you can't have shlichus because you're not a bailim. So then we have to introduce a new parsha called Zachar Li'adam Shelo B'fanav. So when we apply this to a katan, right, what's going to create a kinyan here? It's not the das of the katan. He's a labar das. He can't generate a kinyan. But rather it's das acheres makneh. At that point, once it's das acheres makneh, what kicks in is zechia. But not zechia mitam shlichus, because shlichus can't operate in a case of Das Acheres Makneh, but rather Zechia as a separate mechanism, Shalom Mitam Shlichus. So therefore, in a case of Das Acheres Makneh, the Kohen could be Zocher. The Mezakeh is operating and standing on the shoulders of Zachar Li'adam Shelo B'fanav, which, according to Tosfos, is Zechia Mitam Shlichus, and a Kohen can't have Shlichus. But the answer is that even though the Katan can't have shlichus, he can still have zechia, because zechia operates without shlichus in a case where the kone does not have das kone. Now we get to hefker. A Katan wants to be zochim in a hefker. There's no das Acheres Makneh. If there's no das Acheres Makneh, then he has to supply the das. And if he has to supply the das, well, he's a la bar hachi because he's a Katan. See, I'm not sure if what we're saying here is midin siba or midin simon. In other words, are we saying that I'm going to prove to you that zechia is not operating midin shlichus in the case of das acheres makneh? Or are we going a step further? We're saying, now I understand why zechia is lav mitam shlichus. In other words, are we answering the question why zechia operates and is effective on behalf of Katan? Well, that question we're not asking. We're just proving that zechia for a Katan is shalom mitam shlichus, and we're explaining that Allah. No, it's basically our analysis. Our logic tells me why it can't operate mitam shlichus, but we still have a leap of faith to achieve zechia shalom mitam shlichus. So is that like a gzeras hakosav, like we called it a new parsha? You know, the Torah says that the Nesiim could be zocha on behalf of all of the bnei hashevet, of their shevet, in Akkadian Eretz Yisrael, including Ketana. So that produces the principle of Zachar Yolim Shalom B'fana. You'll ask me, how could there be schia for a Katan if a Katan is mufka from Shlichus? The answer is we're going to have to assume that there's some new mechanism here called schia, which is shalom mitam shlichus, and that operates whenever you have das acheres makneh. Because you see, we still really, when you think about it, I don't know if we have an answer to the question. Well, why in das acheres makneh can we simply avoid and circumvent shlichus? You know, I mean, just because it's das acheres makneh, therefore we have some sort of new power of schia shalom mitam shlichus. What's the logical reason for that? I mean, again, I understand that in a case of das acheres makneh, there's no possibility of setting up a shliach, and therefore schia could not possibly be mitam shlichus because shlichus couldn't operate here. So that much I do understand, but I still don't understand why Das Acheres Makneh supplies me with a new parsha and a new mechanism, a super duper mechanism called Zechia, which is not mitam shlichus. I think perhaps it's what I call definitional. What do I mean by definitional? What is the definition of Das Acheres Makneh? Das Acheres Makneh means Zocher Liodem Shalom B'fana. I mean, what does it mean that I could be Zocher, right? I could be Makneh. Let me put it that way. I could be Makneh something to you. Why? If not Bitam Schia, how does that work? So in a certain sense, there's an equation between Das Acheres Makneh and Zocher Liodem Shalom B'fana. Like almost like a merger of those two concepts, those two principles. if Das Acheres Makneh is producing Zoch in the Adam, then it cannot be based on Shlichus, because since there's no din of Das Kona, he's not the Bailim, and therefore he cannot make a Shlich, as Rav Chaim said. Okay. Now Tosfos asks the following question: V'im Tomar v'hech bedaktikim begitin v'zoche lacherim midepodem ma'aseh lacherim. So a katan could be zocha lacherim, and that's a shita RavAsi. And the Gemara proves that from the fact that the katan could be poda ma'aseh lacherim. Right. So let's say you own ma'aseh sheni, and you want to be poded. You could give the katan or the ketana. That's the case of Omavriya. You can give her Mos, and now she can go ahead and be poded the ma'aseh sheni on my behalf, on your behalf. Halo afilu atzmo lo zochi b'deraisa kishe'ein das acheres maknos. Ubechilu maser mi ika das acheres makna acherim al yidei zechias katan. So again, we're not talking about the fact that the gadol, right, the adon of the Omer, whatever it is able to give a pot of mos over to the Omer Vri, over to the Ketana. That's straightforward Das Acheres Mak. But now she goes ahead and she's poda with that money, the tvua of Ma'aseh Sheni on behalf of so-and-so, her master. And that's going to prove, says the Gemara Gittin, that a katan is zochel acherim. Now, in the case of Pidyon Ma'aseh Sheni, there's no Das Acheres Makneh. Unless we assume that maybe Hegdesh is like a Das Acheres, but I don't know that that's so. So afilu liatzmo lo zochi midaraisa. If the katan wants to be zoche and ma'aseh sheni On a Deraisa level, he can't do so because a cotton can only be zocher through Das Acheres Makneh. And in the case of Masechet, there's no Das Acheres Makneh. The Shlomo because Sabra Makshe, the Kmoshe Zochali Atzmo Bechilu Maser Min Torah. Machmas the Mufla Samach Leish Doraisa Kmochein Zochal Acheres Min Torah. So Tosfos here introduces the concept of Mufla Samach Leish. And Mufla Samach Leish is a Doraisa Halacha, and that allows a Mufla Samach Leish to be Machal Maser on a Doraisa level. So he has Maser, and he's Machal it, transferring its Kiddush over to Mos. And that he can do on behalf of himself, meaning if he has his own master, therefore he can do it on behalf of someone else. Even though there's no Das Acheres Makneh. So let's see the language of Tosfos is not here, but in Gittin Daf Ayin, Dibra Maskelu Upodu Behen Maseshem. Frek Tosfos in Tomer Heich Podel Acherim Afilu Man Yom Zochel Acherim Hainu Kishadas Acheres Makno Sam Lacherim Upidias Maser Nehidach Ashvini Lo Kizochel Acherim Mikomakom ein Das Acheres Makno Sam Lacherim Al Yidei Zchias Katan V'avi Kmo Mitzia Delo Zochim Midaraisa. So whenever a katan is zochel acherim, it's going to have to be because what kicks in here is Das Acheres Makneh. If you don't have Das Acheres Makneh, he can't be zochel acherim. And to be poda maser, which is like being zochel acherim, but there's no Das Acheres Makneh son. So just like a katan cannot be zocher a mitzia on a doraisa level, because there's no Das Acheres Makneh, so what's Tosfos kasha now? How could it be poda masasheni lacherim? So again, how could he be poda his own masasheni? Let's read it one more time. V'im tomer heich poda lacherim. Ha'afilu man yom zochel acherim anu kishadas acheres makno sam lacherim p'tias masasheni nehidach hashvina le kizochel acherim mikom makom ein das acheres makno sam lacherim al yidei zchias hakot v'avi kmo mitzia. I'm just not sure, according to Tosfos, how could it be poda his own maser? Mufla samach liishto raisu chumaso truma v'chilulo chilul Im legabi moment zochel acher min haTorah. Kishadas Acheres Makneh osam. Chilul Maser yesh lo lahoil afilu below Das Acheres. Not sure. So this requires a lot more work, and Belinetta will try to pick this up. What's today? Today's Thursday. Maybe on Sunday, we'll try to pick this up. This whole issue about pidyon maser, both lacherim, liatzmo, where there's no das acheres makneh, and we're going to prove that cotton zochel acherim midoraisa based on the fact that you can pose to someone else's maser, but it doesn't seem like anyone has a havamina that a cotton could be zochel acherim unless it's das acheres makneh, and in pidyon maser there's no das acheres makneh. So somehow Tosfos introduces here a new element to the equation, which is mufla samach leish. But I'm not sure exactly how that works. Okay, then. So let me wish you a Shabbat Shalom and thank you so much. Okay, all the best. Chodesh Tov.